Hello and welcome to another episode of A Simple Path to Wellbeing podcast. My name is Paul Garrigan. So I've recently been reading this book called Imaginal Love, The Meaning and Imagination of Corbin and James Hillman. And the book is by Tom Cheetham. And this is a topic that has been fascinating me for a few years now. I started to become interested in what's called the imaginal realm. A few years prior to realizing that it was called the imaginal realm. In fact, when I started experimenting with this stuff, it really felt I was doing something almost taboo, because I was I came from a tradition of Vipassana meditation, where images and experiences that involve images are often, I'd say, almost disregarded or seen as more of a hindrance than anything else. But I'd kind of reach a point where I felt that I'd achieved what I was looking for with the Vipassana, so there seemed to be no harm in working with images as well. And then I came across teachers such as Rob Borbia, a Buddhist teacher who was very much into the imaginal realm, and he led me onto people like Corbin and James Hillman, who are talked about in this book. So Corbin was a French philosopher who's often kind of credited with really promoting this idea of the imaginal realm. And you also had James Hillman, who was an American psychologist. I think they were both very much influenced by Carl Jung and his work. So this book, I mean, it just I found it fascinating. One of the things I find when I read these books is often I may go on a very different tangent than what the writer may have intended. So. And often, it's kind of like I riff off people's ideas, and it kind of triggers ideas of my own, or reminds me of things of my own. So, please forgive me if I completely misunderstand what the writer is trying to say. But that's the joy of it. I think that's the experience, the wonderful experience of reading. It's this real meeting between the person who's writing it and the person who's reading it, and something useful can come out of that. My own experience of teaching, I will often, do one-to-one sessions with clients, and somebody will come back to me, maybe weeks or months later, and say, that thing you told me was so useful to me. And then I'll kind of realize that they actually misunderstood what I was saying, but it still ended up being very, very helpful for them. And I think that's what's so wonderful, that, even if we can kind of, misunderstand people, something wonderful can still happen, in this kind of space where we meet. And this is kind of what the imaginal realm is, what it's all about. It's going beyond literalism, which is a big point he's trying to make in this book. By literalism, we somehow, somewhere along the way, and, there's good reasons. I mean, he talks about this in the book, I think, about, if it was maybe... It actually probably started happening around the time of Plato and stuff, the Greeks, that we started to believe that our words were not just descriptions, like vague descriptions of what was there, but that they actually are the truth. So that what we were thinking was literally true, rather than it just kind of being a metaphor that we were using to try to make sense of things. So to give you an example of what I mean, this idea of treating something as literal, rather than just a symbol to represent something. I often explain it this way to when I'm talking to clients. So to give you an example of this, say I'm walking out of the house, and I'm going down the road. And you're standing at the end of the road. Now, from the time I leave my house until I get to you at the end of the road, there will be this very unique and ever-changing experience. So during that time that I leave the house, I will encounter all of these different sights and sounds and sensations and smells. And then when I get to you, you could ask me, well, what just happened? And I would say, I just walked from the house. Now that I just walked from the house is just a symbol for what happened, and there's no way those words could ever capture that experience, though, that unique experience that will never be repeated again, of this ever-changing sights, sounds, smells and thoughts that happened during that time. Now this replacing what happens that could never be captured in words with kind of descriptions, it's what our thinking does, and it can be very useful. Like if someone asked you what you've been doing, and you kind of explain every sight and sound and smell and thought you've had over the last even 10 minutes, it'd be a pretty difficult conversation probably for most people. But the problem is that rather than just using these descriptions as for what they are, it's just kind of just standing in for something else, we actually start to believe they're literally true. And this makes our life feel very dead. Let me give you a quote from this book, Imaginal Love. It is the literal that is abstract. The real world is far too rich, complex and manifold to ever be encompassed by any literalism. Literalism is the root of disembodiment and the meaningless of nihilism. There is in fact no literal language. There is only language that we attempt to understand literally. So it's the literal that is abstract. Here's another quote from Tom Cheetham, where he describes the price we pay for this literalism. By placing the imagination at the centre of creation, we will come to understand that the desire to find a concrete solidity in which to anchor our sense of reality of the world and of ourselves starts us on a dangerous path towards the fundamentalist literalism that is underlying evil of all idolatries and the roots of madness. So we're looking for this, we turn to this kind of literalism out of fear because we want to make sense of things. We want things to be manageable and easy to control. But this leads to what he called idolatry, or what Corbin referred to as idolatry, which means we actually start to worship our descriptions as if they were idols, as if they were real things. And of course, when you look at so many of the problems in the world, it usually, is based on literalism and people insisting that what they believe is literally true, rather than just a vague attempt to understand something that is impossible to explain. He goes on to say, the goal of incarnate life is to be in love with the world. Such a life in sympathy with beings is lived in love. But Corbin warns us, this can go off wrong in two ways. You can love a being without perceiving its transcendence. Then you experience it as opaque, static and fixed. Then it becomes an idol and you become an idolater, a fundamentalist. Or you can be so in love with transcendence itself that you ignore the present reality of the being through whom the transcendence must be manifested. Then the icon loses its grounding in the world. This is the trap of a disembodied spirituality that attempts to transcend the world without ever living in it. That is incredible. I mean, that so sums up the mistakes I made. So on one hand, for years, I was looking for the solution in some form of literalism by kind of, thinking the right thought or seeing the world the right way. And then that didn't work. So my next path was to try to transcend the world, to find something that was completely beyond the literalism. But the truth is somewhere in the middle. So he tries to explain in his book, how this kind of literalism manifests. And he talks about Carl Jung. And he says, it is, as Jung would have it, usually the feeling function that is out of order. We wall off portions of our inner life because they hurt. It happens unconsciously for the most part. And for a while it works. But because everything is connected in unknown and unpredictable ways, the frozen parts of our life begin to spread. Cramped, crippled, dead and cold. Whole terrains of our experience begin to solidify. This is one way that literalism begins to dominate the imagination. And static imagination is no imagination at all. It is dogma and ideology. So in response to fear and being hurt, we can grab on to these simple, or maybe not so simple, maybe quite complex ideas about the world. And it's like there's this idea, if I can just kind of have the right way of thinking about life, then I'll be okay. And we buy into some, particular worldview, some particular way of looking at life, and we proclaim that is the truth. And what we don't see is that's like putting ourselves inside of a prison. That limits our life. It limits who we are. And that eventually becomes painful. And of course, when we do that, when we start to, insist that our way now of viewing life is correct, that's obviously going to bring us in conflict with other people who have different truths. And because, our particular truth is so important for us, that our particular worldview is so important to us, that then brings us into conflict with other people. And the harder, people attack our precious, literal view of things, the harder we will feel compelled to defend it. Now, the answer to all of this, to escape all of this, is through the imagination and through letting go of literalism. This understanding that really nobody has a clue what's going on. All we have is our stories. And sure, we can say that some stories are more useful than other stories, but that the stories never capture what's actually happening. It's kind of, like this idea that the Buddha said, don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. Literalism is mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. We think that that's the moon. And imagine how different it would be if we could all just start to see that all of these ideas are, none of them are true. But they don't have to be true to be useful. That in a way, truth is a red herring. And our ideas about what's true won't bring us peace. So it's freeing the imagination out of its shackles, which is what imaginal work is all about. That will bring us to peace. So there's another wonderful quote later on in the book where he describes how we can actually approach this. The openings require a loosening of your attention and relaxing of your intentions. You have to stop grasping at the world. You have to come to feel that nothing is literal. Nothing is only what it seems to be on the surface. He goes on later to remind us, abstraction is a defensive and isolating stance towards reality. It helps us hold people and things at a distance. So really, what this comes back to, and what working with our imagination, with the imaginal, comes back to, is even though we will never be able to achieve it, perhaps, but is an attempt to let the world tell us what it is, rather than us constantly telling it what it is. Or as he so wonderfully puts it, to give the world back to itself. And this is very similar to a lot of the Buddhist teachers. So you had someone like Ajahn Bodhasa, who would say things like, nothing whatsoever should be clung to as me or mine. Give it all back. So rather than trying to force our ideas about the world onto the world, there's this willingness to let it tell us its story through our imagination and see what that does. See, the whole point of this is to see what this does. It's not necessarily it's not, for me anyway, to arrive at any kind of truth. To me, there is no truth. It's about what does relating to life in this world way actually do? What does it do to our experience? What does it do to us? And for me, this leads to a deepening sense of stillness and peace. So thanks very much for listening. If you'd like to do some coaching with me, I'll leave details below in the comments and you can contact me. And I'll see you again next time.